There was a village built of crumbling clay and rotting wood. It squatted, ugly, under a broiling sun, like a sick, mangy animal waiting to die. It had a name, but the name was of little consequence. It had an age, but few people cared how old it was. It lay somewhere in the southwest on the fringe of a desert, a 2-block-long main street, limed with squalid frame stores and a few adobe huts. They shook and wheezed and groaned like fired old men whenever a wagon went by, which was seldom, raising the dust and leaving it to hang like a fog. On this day, even the few stores that were not boarded up had closed their doors. Scrawled signs announced that each was closed for the funeral or will be open after funeral. And also on this day the street was empty, save for a sway-backed horse pushing an aged snout into the water trough and flicking off the glossy green flies that descended on its flanks by the hundreds. Its switching tail was the only movement on the main street. Sounds came loudly and intermittently from around the corner, hammering, the creak of boards, then the sound as of some heavy object being dropped through the air, only to be caught up short. They were building a gallows. Incongruously, here was activity, here was fresh lumber, here were men at work. The gallows stood 16 feet high. 4 giant pillars supported a platform with a trapdoor. Over it was a heavy cross beam, from which dangled a thick rope, a noose expertly tied at its end. This village and its people shared an infection. It was the germ of misery, of hopelessness, of loss of faith. And for the faithless, the hopeless, the misery-laden, there is time, ample time, to engage in one of the other pursuits of men. They begin to destroy themselves. Peter Sykes walked down the main street, pulling an overladen pack mule. The animal was sick and overworked. It stumbled along, head down, eyes half closed. At intervals, Sykes yanked viciously on the rope. The animal would start, then seem to push itself forward, eyes glazed with pain and fatigue, bony body white with sweat. Pots and pans, bottles, magazines, coiled rope, and nondescript boxes protruded from the saddlebags by which the mule was weighted down. Peter Sykes had small eyes that darted this way and that from a fat and filthy face. As he moved his massive bulk through the dust, from time to time he produced a bottle from his hip pocket and took a long, luxurious drink. The liquor dribbled from the corners of his mouth and traveled in little rivulets through his beard stubble. "All right, ladies and gents," he suddenly shrieked when he got halfway down the main street. "It's Peter Sykes, back from St. Louis, and stocked up with everything that's needed for kitchen, barn," and he held the pint bottle up high, "the dried throat and the swollen tongue." He boomed out his fat man's laughter and shoved the bottle back into his hip pocket. He stopped the mule in front of a wooden building that was the town jail. He dropped the rope in the dust and climbed laboriously to the wooden plank sidewalk. A barred window faced the street. Sykes peered through the bars into the dark cell. A thin Mexican boy sat on the bench at the far end, his hands resting quietly on his lap, his head bent forward. "Mr. Gallegos, I believe," Sykes said, bowing from his vast waist. He chuckled. The obese body shook, and the folds of his face seemed to come alive like wriggling snakes. "Mr. Gallegos," he repeated. He scratched his jaw in an exaggerated pretense of thought. "Today's a special day, isn't it? Now, let's see. What's this special day? He grinned and snapped his fingers. I remember now. It's just this moment come back to me. Sykes pointed through the bars. Today, you're gonna get hanged, boy. Obscene laughter poured out of him. Today, young Mr. Gallegos, killer of children, dangles at the gallows. He limped away from the window, tears of laughter rolling from his eyes. Two men were walking down the wooden sidewalk toward him. His laughter died out, his eyes narrowed and took on a different expression. These were customers, and Peter Sykes' entire life was built upon commerce. He waddled over to the nearer man, grabbed him in a perspiring fist. Good whiskey from St. Louis, Jonesy, he said importantly. He patted his hip pocket. 85 cents a fifth. The man looked embarrassed and shook off Sykes' hand. Immediately, Sykes turned to the other passerby, blocked him with his big bulk, shoved his face close to him and rolled his eyes. His voice, almost inaudible, was like a leer. Postcards, Eddie, he whispered, wiggling his tongue. Wonderful postcards this trip. French dancing girls in their native costumes. Sykes giggled, jammed his elbow in the man's ribs, then laughed aloud as he walked away, head down. Sykes was still chuckling as he went back to the jail and into the sheriff's office. It was a bare room with a makeshift desk, a gun rack, and a barred door leading to the single cell. John Coke sat behind the desk, a tarnished badge on his worn and dusty leather vest. His long, lean, tanned face, the eyes deep-set and tired, showed 47 hard years indelibly imprinted in lines over the cheekbones and on either side of the jaw. Coke barely glanced at Sykes, then busied himself with papers on the desk. He felt the intrusion of the fat man and the sense of envelopment that Sykes carried with him. What'll it be for you today, Mr. Coke? Sykes' shrill voice intruded upon the quiet of the room. Oh, sorry, Sykes, not the other guy. What'll it be for you today, Mr. Coke? Sykes' shrill voice intruded upon the quiet of the room. Don't need any more rope, do you? He called out toward the barred door. Ought to see that fancy 5-strand hemp I sold the town for your party, Gallegos. It could lift about 5 of you. He lumbered across the room to stand close to the cell door. The look he threw at Gallegos was as much a part of him as his rolls of fat. There was a meanness to it, a raw prejudice, a naked dislike of other people. Not any more at home like you are there, Sykes laughed out loud, then asked, What do you fancy today, Mr. Coke? What do I fancy, Mr. Sykes? Coke forced himself to keep his voice steady and low. I'll tell you what I fancy. I'd like you to take your fat carcass in your lad mouth out into the air. This is a small room and it's the hot time of the morning. The grin on the man's face grew tight and strained. Sykes knew what Coke was feeling. He was not insensitive to the anger he aroused in other people, but he'd lived a life of walking over other people's anger and disgust. It was his own peculiar strength. How about you, Mr. Gallegos? Sykes jeered. What would be your pleasure this morning? Maybe a nice hacksaw? Again, his whole body quivered with laughter, but it faded when he saw the look on the Mexican boy's face. The black eyes that caught and pierced him held fathomless pools of hate. This one I wouldn't miss, Sykes gloated. I just wouldn't want to miss this one. He took the bottle from his hip pocket, uncorked it with his teeth. There's going to be a funeral procession down this street, Gallegos. You better look out and watch. They're burying the little girl you mangled under your wagon. You're sobered up now, aren't you, Gallegos? You remember that little girl, don't you? You got stinking drunk, rode a wagon down the street and what you did to that poor little girl. The Mexican boy leapt from the bench, slammed against the bars, and thrust an arm out through them, trying to reach the fat man. But Sykes nimbly stepped back a foot and waggled a fat finger. Mr. Gallegos, you'll get your chance to move around this afternoon. You'll be able to kick and kick and kick. This struck him as so funny that he threw back his head and roared. Coke stared at Sykes. God, what an animal, he thought. What a filthy animal. Some men were built for their trade. They were designed to be cheats, hucksters, medicine men. There must be some kind of mold, he thought. The thought ran through his mind, which produced the filth that stood in front of him, holding the rock-gut whiskey. You ought to take a drink of this, Sheriff, Sykes' voice patronized Coke. It's a good tonic. He patted the flab that hung over his belt. Puts a little grizzle there. Sets you up great for good hanging. Yes, sir. Makes you feel strong and firm. He held out his vast, flabby arm and made a muscle. You ought to feel this. Coke's mouth trembled. I don't touch dog meat, Sykes. The bottle slammed down on the desktop. You talk big behind a badge, Mr. Coke. It just sounds big to you, Mr. Sykes, because you're a midget. You only grew up as high as a money belt, and that's a low height for a man. Sykes' eyes glittered a little. I've always had a question about you, Coke, he said in a low voice. Seems you got a thing for foreigners and strays, but you're mighty tight-lipped when it comes to your own. Coke rose from his chair. You're not my own, Sykes, so don't claim any kinship. He pointed toward the cell. And as for that boy in there, he had his trial, and today he's going to swing for it. There's nothing in his sentence that says he's got to be tormented by a pig who sells trinkets at funerals. He stared at the fat man, and Sykes had to turn away. Go on, get out of here. Sykes shuffled toward the door, anger building up inside him. Anger at being despised. Anger at the itchy sweat that rolled down his body. Anger because hatred was his own special province. Hatred of people. Hatred of all he had to do to stay alive. He wanted to walk out without saying anything more, but found himself turning at the door. When the day is over, Mr. Coke, he asked, which one will you weep for? Coke looked at the thin Mexican boy whose hands gripped the bars and whose young face suddenly looked so old. I've got enough tears for both, Mr. Sykes, he answered quietly. The fat man walked out onto the street and heard the sound of the rolling wagon wheels. He shaded his eyes against the blinding sun. The funeral procession was turning the corner at the far end of the street. The long line of people included the black-garbed figures of a middle-aged man and his wife, who walked behind a minister. Behind them, in the center of the column, was the wagon with the unpainted pine box. The box was very small. Sykes moved his fat bulk down the dusty street, and with a great flourish removed his hat and held it over his heart. He waited until the middle-aged couple were a few feet from him, and then joined the procession. Mr. and Mrs. Canfield, Sykes panted as he shuffled along beside them. He was sweating and half out of breath, but his tone was deep and mournful. I'm real sorry about this. My condolences to you, but this afternoon it's going to be a lot cheerier. We're going to string up that dirty little animal who done this. The husband and wife stared at him incredulously, and the woman bit her lip and turned away. Sykes screwed up his face like a little baby beginning to cry. It's God's will, Mr. and Mrs. Canfield, he screeched. It's God's will. But she's going to be avenged. She's going to be avenged. So you don't have no worries on that score. The Mexican who done it's going to pay for it. Coke came up behind Sykes, pulled him by the back of his jacket and half yanked him off his feet. Sykes whirled around, a hand raised. This was knocked aside by the tall sheriff, whose face was white and grim. "Some other time, Sykes, huh?" Coke said quietly. "Some other time act like a man with no brains, but not now. Now you keep quiet." Sykes glared at him, but the look on the other man's face was the kind you didn't talk back to. This crazy goddamn sheriff, this frantic, well, what the hell? He'd made his position known. The Canfields had seen him. He had been properly doleful, and he'd supplied the rope for the hanging. They'd remember that. His eyes suddenly blinked and narrowed. He nudged Coke. "Now look at that, will you? Now ain't that the most gall you ever seen in one place? There's Gallegos, old man. He's got the nerve, the honest-to-God nerve to show himself in broad daylight, and during the funeral procession, too. Somebody ought to take a horsewhip to that dirty little—" The rest of the words never came out. He saw Coke's baleful face, and Sykes forced a smile. Down the street, Pedro Gallegos and his little 10-year-old daughter, Estrellita, were standing in the center of the road waiting for the procession. Pedro Gallegos was 68 years old. He was thin, scrawny, with bent shoulders, and the lines in his face looked as if they'd been hewn in rock. Sun had done it, and toil, and now sorrow. Sorrow beyond any kind of words. He held the little girl's hand tightly, and as the funeral procession got closer, he whispered something in her ear, and then gently pushed her forward. When the Canfields came abreast, Estrellita walked out and stood in front of them. They stopped, looking at the little girl, and then over toward the old Mexican, whose lips trembled, whose features worked as he whispered something soundlessly, then motioned toward the little girl to speak. Estrellita looked at the ground and mumbled something in a low voice. Gallegos half shouted from a few feet away, "Louder, Estrellita! Tell them, darling! Tell them, my heart! Speak! Go ahead!" The Canfields looked away in white-faced, shocked embarrassment. "My father wishes me to tell you," the little girl began. "My father wishes me to tell you that—" The words died in her throat. She looked fearfully over her shoulder toward her father. "My father wishes me to tell you," she said, "that his heart is broken. That if he could give his own life in return," Pedro Gallegos whispered. And then it came out later, "His own life in return, his own life in return, Estrellita." Mrs. Canfield's eyes were tightly shut, and her husband gripped her arm. "His own life in return," Estrellita said. "He would do so with great willingness." She wet her lips. Her thin, little face looked agonized. He understands." Once again, the words stopped. Pedro Gallegos took a stumbling step toward her, tears rolling down his face. "He understands what it is like to lose your flesh," the old man said. "He understands, and he's sad." He asks now that the old man sobbed aloud. "Estrellita, tell them, say it to them. He asks that you have no malice for her son Luis, who did this awful thing. He did not do it on purpose. He is sick in his heart and in his mind because of it." The little girl scuffled barefoot in the dust, her hands tightly intertwined behind her back, her dark little face flushed with pain and misery. Her father walked another few feet toward the Canfields, then with palms outstretched, dropped to his knees in the dust. Senora, the old man pleaded, "please do not let them kill my son. He will spend the rest of his life, and mine, in your service. Anything you wish. But please do not take my son's life." The little girl ran to throw herself into her father's arms and bury her face against his shoulder. He held her tightly, stroking her hair and crooning softly into her ear, something in Spanish that the others could not hear. The Canfields looked at one another, and the husband said in a choked voice, Don't hold us up any further, please. Can't you see we're burying our daughter today? He took his wife's arm, and they continued to walk toward the cemetery at the edge of the town, a patch of barren sand dotted irregularly with inexpertly carved, ugly stones and makeshift wooden crosses, as if the squalor of living had its own counterpart in death. Why couldn't he have stayed away, Canfield thought. Why do you have to come out this afternoon? Why does he have to throw more pain on us when his son has already supplied the ultimate in pain? Oh God, Sheriff Coke thought, oh dear God, this place, this town full of ugly people, this sapper of strength and dignity that robs the living and now even the dead with the heat of it and the misery of it. Peter Sykes squinted at the disappearing procession. It don't make a damn, really, he thought, that they didn't buy the coffin from him. Next time they would. He'd supplied the rope for the hanging, and there was 38% markup on the rope. Next time the coffin, he thought. Next time he'd be here in time for the bidding. That was what Sykes thought, as the thin column of people in the wagon with the pine box disappeared into the fields beyond the town, going toward the ugly little cemetery that laid under the hot southwestern desert sun. There were no flowers, none at all. It was too hot for flowers. Pedro Gallegos, holding tight to his little daughter's hand, walked slowly toward the jail. The ragged, dusty men on the street moved aside as he passed and stared coldly at him. He felt their hostility and forced himself to walk straight ahead. Coke stood near the cell, and he too noticed the angry faces of the townspeople. Gallegos looked around at these faces, released Estrelita's hand, and held out his own in front of him. Please, he puckered. His puckered, weather-beaten old face with the deeply etched lines and sad eyes pleaded with him. My son did not mean to do it. He's a lover of children, just as you all are. He is a lover of children. He felt a shocking, tearing pain over his right eye as a stone glanced off the side of his head. It drew blood. Estrelita let out a small scream. Luis gripped the bars of the cell and shouted out at his father, Padre, por favor, váyase a la casa, no se la necesita aquí. Peter Sykes grinned. He'll do you no good here. Is that what you say to this old man, Gallegos? This is a staunch figure of a man, Luis. This father, look at him, the patriarch of the Mexican community. He rumbled deep laughter from his gut. The others did not share the laughter, but continued to stare at the old man. Father, Luis said urgently in a soft voice, take Estrelita home. They will hurt you if you stay here, please. Go home now. The old man's eyes were wet. He wiped the blood from his eye, reached in his pocket, and took out a coin, which he held out toward his son. Luis, he said, a lucky coin. It is said that one can make a wish on it. Someone in the crowd laughed, but at that moment Peter Sykes did not laugh. He looked at the coin, squinty-eyed, suddenly very interested. Coke stepped in front of the cell window. Go home, old man, he said gently. Make wishes, or pray. But Luis is right. You'll do no good here. You have never been drunk, Mr. Sheriff, the old man asked. You've never felt such misery rising in you that salvation seemed to look at you from only out of a bottle? The blood was running again from the cut over his eye. You never felt pain, such pain that you had to ride through the night and not look behind you? He gestured toward the cell. My son was hungry, and he felt such a pain. And he drank too much, and he rode down the street, not looking, not seeing. He had a sadness deep inside, sadness that was not there enough to eat. Sadness that they had no work, sadness that the earth all around him was growing barren in the sun, and he did not see the little girl. He never saw her for an instant. Pedro Gallegos fumbled blindly for his daughter's hand, gripped it, and pulled her closer to him. Coke said nothing. The old man knew that he had said enough, perhaps too much, and all of it to no avail. He was a dirty old Mexican, and his words carried no meaning to the men who listened to them. He was a dirty old Mexican, and he was the father of a murderer. So Pedro Gallegos shuffled away down the dusty street. Estrellita started to follow him, but stopped when Sykes whistled at her. "Come over here," the fat man said. Estrellita stood stock still. "Come over here," Sykes repeated urgently. "I won't hurt you." The little girl went slowly to him. Sykes held her tight by the shoulders and shoved his fat, sweaty face close to hers. "You tell your papa," he said softly. "Understand? Comprende? You tell your papa I want to help him. Tell him that coin of his is worthless. But I have a magic dust that turns hate to love. Understand? Comprende? It turns hate to love. You tell him that. A magic dust. But it is very precious. Understand it? Very, very dear." The little girl nodded. Sykes looked around surreptitiously. 500 pesos, he said. "You tell your papa, bring 500 pesos in an hour, and I will sell him the magic dust that makes people love and forgive. Understand?" Wide-eyed, Estrellita nodded. She backed away from the fat man and broke into a run. Sykes watched her until she caught up with her father, and they disappeared. The crowd dispersed, and Coke went back into the jail. Sykes sat down on the steps and took out a bag of tobacco from his pocket. He opened it, stared at it, grinned, and finally laughed aloud. Sykes emptied the bag, then went down on his knees and scooped dust into it. He pulled the strings tight with his teeth and swung it back and forth. "Magic dust," he said aloud. "That's what she is. 500 pesos worth of magic dust." Then he threw back his head and laughed and laughed. It was 2:00 in the afternoon when people started to arrive. Battered makeshift wagons full of parents and children from outlying districts, townspeople who erupted into the streets and were drawn compulsively toward the jail. It was almost that time. Coke stood leaning against the whitewashed clay wall of the building, rolling a cigarette. When he finished the cigarette, he gave it to Luis Gallegos. Gallegos let Coke light it for him. "Gracias," he said. "There should be good attendance today," he added simply. "When was it God made people?" Coke asked. "Was it on the 5th day?" "He should have stopped on the 4th. Luis Gallegos shook his head. "They're tired of hating this place, the sun, the ground that is dead under their feet." His fingers gripped the bars. "So they must go out and find something else to hate." A wagon creaked slowly to a stop in front of the jail. A farmer and his wife were on the front seat, and in the back were 6 wide-eyed, excited children. Coke stepped away from the wall toward the wagon. "It isn't a carnival, Rogers," he said. "It's a hanging." The farmer jerked his thumb towards the children. "You mean the kids?" he asked. "They ain't never seen a hanging. I figured it was about time." "Why?" asked Coke. "Why not? They'll learn a lesson. This is what happens to drunk Mexicans who kill kids." Coke smiled. "I guess that's pretty vital." He hesitated. "How do you teach 'em pain, Rogers? Shoot one of 'em in the arm?" The farmer shook his head and said to his wife, "Tell them to stay together. I'll tie up the horses." While the farmer hitched his team, his 6-year-old son crawled off the back of the wagon and wandered over to peer up at the young Mexican framed in the cell window. Luis Gallegos smiled at him. "Are you the man?" the little boy asked. "Are you the one they're going to put the rope on?" "See, little one, I am the man." "Will it hurt?" Gallegos closed his eyes. "If God wills it." Coke gently pushed the boy aside. "Go on," he ordered. "Go with your dad." Then he turned toward Luis. "It's about that time." Gallegos nodded. "I'm ready, Sheriff." The townspeople watched as Coke and a deputy led Luis Gallegos out of the jail, his hands manacled together. They started a slow walk down the street toward the gallows. The people closed ranks, and as if by common consent, followed them. A priest stood on the gallows, waiting. He was Mexican, and he knew his clerical garb meant nothing to these people. The brown skin set him apart, and the fact that he spoke little English. The cross that hung from his neck was no symbol of peace to the grim men and women who gathered around the gallows. A Mexican priest was a Mexican, and the priest understood this as he stood atop the platform and watched Luis Gallegos, his hands manacled in front of him, walk slowly up the steps toward him. A man in the first row called out impatiently, "What the hell? That should have been done in jail. Let's get on with it." There were nods of assent, but no other voices. This was a quiet crowd, anxious to have happen what had to happen. But there was no fire under these people. There was no rage. Their hatred was like themselves. It was quieted down by the hot sun, measured by the dictates of the climate. So it was a quiet crowd, but they knew what they wanted. Peter Sykes stood in front of the jail, looking expectantly down the street until he saw Pedro Gallegos turn the corner at the far end and run toward him. Sykes' eyes shone. He held up the little bag and dangled it in the air. Then crooked the finger of his free hand and waggled it toward the old man. Sykes kicked open the door to the jail. Silently pointed toward the interior as Pedro Gallegos came up to him. They went inside, and Sykes closed the door. "Your daughter told you, old man?" Gallegos swallowed. His face was wet with a combination of sweat and tears. His voice shook, and he answered, "She told me. She said you had dust, a dust of magic properties." Sykes smiled. "That's the old idea, old man. Sprinkle over the heads of people. It'll make them feel sympathy for your son. It's very rare, you know. It's magic." His face changed, and something hard crept in the lines by the mouth. "You brought the money, old man?" Gallegos reached inside his worn, shabby shirt and took out a small bag of his own, tied at the top with string. He untied it and emptied the contents into his palm. There were 3 gold pieces. Sykes felt his palms perspire. "Gold pieces, huh?" he said, taking a breath. "Where'd you get them?" "All of my friends went into the city. One sold a wagon, another sold a horse some borrowed. We got many pesos and we converted them." He reached for the bag of dust, but Sykes pulled it back. Gallegos wet his lips. "It will work, Mr. Sykes?" he asked. "The magic dust, it will work? You sold the rope to hang my son. Now you sell me that which will save him?" "I'm a businessman, Mr. Gallegos," Sykes said reasonably. "I sell that which is needed." He shook his head. "I make no distinctions. This will work. Like I told you, it's magic." Sykes smiled, held out his hand. The old man slowly dropped the coins, one by one, into it, then held his own hand out for the dust, which Sykes very deliberately turned over to him. Gallegos clutched it tightly to him. "It must work," he said. "It must work. It must be magic." Then, propelled by urgency and fear and a sudden hope of salvation, he pulled open the door. "Luis!" he screamed as he ran up. "I'm coming, my son, I'm coming!" Sykes stepped outside, holding the 3 gold pieces in his hand. "Just throw some in the air," he shouted after the old man. "Over their heads," he laughed. "That's right. Then watch the magic happen." "Magic," he said through his laughter. "You go out there and watch that magic." He rubbed his coins together, liked the feel of moisture and the scraping sound of them. He sat down on the steps of the jail. He sat rolling the coins in his sweaty palm and thought that things had a way of coming out all right. He hadn't been around to sell the coffin, but he'd made something out of the day anyway. He felt warm and good inside. He reached in his hip pocket and took out his pint bottle of whiskey. Yes, things had a way of coming out all right. Luis Gallegos knelt on the platform, the rope hanging a few feet above him. The priest administered the blessing in a soft sing-song Latin. Intermittently, a rumble of impatient voices called for an end of prayer and a commencement of the business of the day. But the priest kept his eyes fastened on the back of the kneeling boy's head and made himself oblivious to the sounds. Each time he crossed himself and reached another juncture in the blessing, another moment had passed. Another fragment of Luis Gallegos' life had been pushed aside. So very little remained. At last the priest could do nothing but stand there, his fingers clenched, while Sheriff Coke went to Gallegos, took his elbow, and helped him rise. The deputy placed the noose around his neck and then tightened it. A murmur of approval ran through the crowd. Only Mrs. Canfield, mother of the dead girl, turned her eyes away, not wanting to see, and wishing she hadn't come. Her husband took her arm and motioned with his head toward the platform. It was a silent and symbolic command. On the day of retribution, they, the bereaved, must not look away. They must stand in the front row and watch as justice was done. "Magic!" came the sound of Pedro Gallegos' cracked old voice, rounded the corner and ran toward the crowd. He held the bag of dust high over his head. Out of breath, sweating, stumbling, he ran among the people, scattering the dust over their heads, half sobbing his incantations. "You must pay heed to the magic now," he exhorted them. "You must stop all this and pay heed to the magic." Back and forth he ran, stumbling, landing on his knees, then rising to run again past the gamut of icy faces. A child laughed at the apparition, but his mother put her finger over his mouth, and there was a dead silence as the old man continued to fling dust over their heads and shout, "You must pay heed to the magic, all of you. It is only for love. It is for compassion. The magic is so that my son can live, as you yourselves would want yours to live. Magic, magic, magic." A young man, husky, squat, powerful, thrust his foot out and tripped the old man. He fell face down. The bag dropped from his hands, and he scrabbled across the ground after it. "It's magic," he whispered hoarsely. "Magic is for love. It is for love. The magic is for love." The trap door creaked open. The rope went taut with the weight of the body. The gasp from the crowd built to a roar. The old man covered his face and screamed, "No, no, por el amor de Dios." The ground swayed under him and he turned cold from head to foot. But presently he became aware that the crowd was growing gradually quieter, until at last there was no sound at all. Very slowly his fingers parted, and he peered out to see what had so strangely stilled the crowd. He saw a piece of rope hanging down through the trap door. Beneath it stood Luis Gallegos, the torn noose around his neck, his face white. Only Sykes spoke, his voice tremulous. "That was new rope. 5-strand hemp. The people were silent, baffled. Coke went to Luis Gallegos' side and faced the crowd. "What about it, Mr. Canfield, Mrs. Canfield?" Pedro Gallegos, holding the empty bag, made his way toward where the Canfields stood. "Please," he said, "please. It's a magic. You cannot try to defeat the magic." "Let's try it again," a man called out. There was a murmur of agreement. Coke held tight to Luis Gallegos' arm. "There are only 2 people here," he said, "who have the right to beg an eye for an eye." He turned purposefully to the Canfields. "What about it?" Canfield felt the blood drain from his face. The unfamiliar black suit was heavy and uncomfortable. But heavier was the pressure of the eyes that watched him, the sense of ears waiting for him to speak. It was his wife who answered. "No more today, William," she said softly, shaking her head. "No more." "He killed our child," Canfield said. He killed our child." The woman shook her head. "And a part of himself, too." She looked at the suffering face of Luis Gallegos. "There's been enough pain, William," she said. "Quite enough pain. It has to stop now, or we'll die ourselves." Her husband's face showed indecisiveness, but this was a gentleman, and she knew it. Canfield turned to Coke. "Sheriff Coke," he said quietly, we withdraw the charges." Then he looked up at the dangling rope. There must be another hand in all this, to make rope break like that." He shook his head. "Another hand. Maybe the hand of Providence." Coke took a deep breath and felt something wondrous stirring inside him. "You want to stop it then, Mr. Canfield?" he asked in an official voice. "You have that right." A farmer stepped out of the crowd. "William?" Canfield turned. "We'll leave it like this?" the man asked. Canfield nodded. "We leave it like this. One victim is enough." He faced his fellow townspeople. "I think we should all go home now," he said. He took his wife's arm, and they walked away. By ones and twos, then by groups, the people left the square. Within a few moments, it was empty, save for Coke, the old man, and the young Mexican boy with the manacled hands, the ugly red mark on his throat, the noose around his neck. Coke released the manacles. The boy said wonderingly, I'm free?" Coke felt a weariness he had never known before. "Are any of us free, Louis?" he asked. "But you can go home." He removed the rope from the boy's neck. "You have that much freedom." The boy rose to his feet and clutched his father for support. His knees were weak, and a faintness descended on him. "It was magic, Louis," said the old man. "It was the magic Dasa brought back people love." The boy kissed him. "Yes, my father," he said. "It was the magic. Come, we will go home now." The old man took the boy's face in his hands, nodded, smiled, then burst into laughter. After a moment, Luis Gallegos began to laugh too, and, arms intertwined, they stood laughing uproariously, laughing at the miraculous salvation that had descended upon them, at the joy of being alive. Still laughing, they started home. Coke went back to the jail, glad that one day's work was done. Later, Peter Sykes wandered drunkenly back to the gallows and stared up at the broken rope. He kept shaking his head and mumbling. "I'll be damned," he said to himself. "I'll be goddamned. It was a new rope. It was a brand new rope." He still clutched the 3 gold coins in his hand when he saw that 3 small Mexican children were watching him. Sykes turned away, but somehow, in spite of himself, he felt drawn back to them. Without conscious volition, Sykes flung the coins on the ground at the children's feet. They stood motionless, almost as if they were not breathing. "Go ahead," Sykes yelled. Take 'em, they're yours." Slowly and with great dignity, the children reached down into the dust and each took 1 coin. They then watched the fat man as he wobbled slowly across the square. "Why," the fat man said to himself, "why? Why did I just do that? I don't understand." Once he stopped and looked over his shoulder at the Mexican children. He began to laugh. "Must be the magic," he announced out loud. "That's what she is, magic." The laughter bubbled and gurgled inside him and then burst out into the air. The great noise surrounded him as he walked down the main street past the jail. He had never laughed like that before, and still it came and he couldn't stop. He could be heard blocks away, a fat huckster who waddled through the dust and roared with uncontrollable laughter. The square was empty. The sun had disappeared over the vast horizon that stretched all around the town. An empty tobacco bag lay near the gallows. Soon it would be swallowed up by the desert, as all things were swallowed up. The town, still ugly and still full of squalor, prepared itself for the night. It was small, misery-laden, and this had been the day of a hanging. Of little historical consequence, really. But if there was any moral to be drawn, it might be said that in any quest for magic, in any search for sorcery, it might be wise to first check the human heart. For inside this deep place is a wizardry that costs far more than a few pieces of gold. It was, of course, a fact that no one in the town could articulate this thought. But there was a feeling, there was a mood, and there were questions now, where before no questions had existed. So the town let the starry night enfold it and went to sleep. The next day, the town would again give battle to the sun and the sand. The gallows would be torn down, but the day of the hanging, this had been committed to memory.